Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Friday morning for Friday Focus. Now, this is a little different for us because this is a recorded version rather than the lives that we normally do on a Friday at 7:45. So, if you are engaging in this, we have recorded this earlier in the week, and so we won't have the opportunity to have live chat with you. But please do get involved in the conversation. You know, that's a tagline that we use. Join the conversation. We're interested to hear your perspectives. We're interested to hear your input and examples of what's going on in your particular setting. Now, welcome wherever you are in the world. We know that there are people that are listening right across the world, America, the Middle East, Japan, in Europe. So thank you for being here. This is about taking a moment to step back and consider the bigger questions around what's going on in the education world, and talk to people that are passionate about an aspect of the life of schools. Now, you've seen from the title that today our focus is on early years and how we get early years right. We know that in England, in terms of the review that's going on, there has been a focus on early years. There's certainly talk about the funding questions around whether we're putting enough money where it is. And certainly you'll know that my concentration and a lot of what I've written and said around education, there's not been enough focus on early years. So my intent this morning was to invite two guests, actually three guests, and one of them is not well this morning and couldn't join us. So just a shout out to Mark. I'm sorry you couldn't be with us. We'll catch up with you soon. But my two guests this morning, Emma Tibbitts from Foundations First Education, and Emma Ledger from Forged. Now, Emma, you're in London and Skirts, and Emma Tibbitts, you're in London. Emma Ledger, you're in Spain. So, you know, again, we're just reaching out around the world for people that have got things to say around the education. So, let me introduce the two Emmas to you. It's going to get really confusing, and I would say Emma T and Emma L if I get that right. But thank you for joining us this morning. Emma T, let me ask you to introduce yourself and tell us your passion for this part of the education process.
Absolutely. Well, good morning. And Chris, thank you so much for having me back. It's my second time on your
Yes.
podcast. So thank you. It's great to be back and to be with Emma as well. And yes, it's going to be fun with our names, but we'll do our best to differentiate. Yeah, interestingly, my whole from the start of my career really started in early years quite unintentionally, having completed a degree in primary education. But a job came up down the road at the most idyllic little school that I desperately wanted to teach in. The only downside was that it was advertised for being in early years, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not sure about that. I'm not really sure exactly what that means. You think that they might have touched on it a bit in teacher training, which might be a topic for discussion at some point, having done a primary education degree, but it wasn't. But I thought it's a maternity cover. Let's just go for it because I really want to teach at this school. It's a foot in the door. So I was successful. I did get the job and I found myself in early years for what I thought was just going to be a quick end to the summer term. But I'm so pleased I went for that job because I realised straight away after getting over the kind of initial shock of being in a very different environment that actually it's fundamentally the best place to be. And as a practitioner, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, and I've taught all year groups. I've been a head teacher. I've been on governing boards as vice chairs. I consult nationally for early years and look at early years programs for teacher trainers. And I've also been an early years consultant for London's largest educational trust. So I have been around quite a bit and I've seen that scope of, you know, the joy of kind of setting up brand new schools and starting with that early years provision as a blank canvas. But I've also done the flip side where I've gone into schools that need some serious support and intervention with that sort of rapid school improvement lens. So seen both sides. And currently, although I dip into the consultant space, I am a practitioner at heart. So I will take on interim leadership roles so that I'm still very in touch with the realities, the challenges, the joys of working in education. So I do that, and I'm in a school 3 days a week at the moment that is requiring some serious intervention. Um, and I also am the founder and director of Foundations First. The name says it all. I believe that getting the foundations right, first of all, laying those firm foundations is fundamentally important in education. So we don't just specialise in early years. We actually care about education all through. But at the heart of what we do at Foundations First is character education. We care about the individual child and how we nurture, we grow, and we develop those what we believe to be essential characteristics for lifelong success, however you might define that. Another interesting conversation. So we care about schools not just putting their values on a banner, if you like. We want curious children. We want imaginative children. They are great things to want. And I do believe that most schools genuinely want those things. I don't always think schools necessarily know or have the tools to really nurture and grow those things. And we look at the best practice in early years and how that can be stretched and learned from across all year groups, all the way through education. So one book I will always talk to is Lifelong Kindergarten by Mitch Resnick. And that's essentially looking at that best practice in early years and how much we can learn from that. So I'm very passionate about promoting that and doing more early years everywhere else.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's me.
Emma, that's why I invite you to come, because you speak with such passion and you speak with authority in that. That really, that's an interesting start. Emma L, just introduce yourself. Tell us your journey. Tell us your passions in this area. Why you're here.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, thank you for inviting me on the show. This is my first opportunity to do a podcast with you. So I'm joining the veteran Emma here today, and it sounds like we're going to make a good team, double Emmas. I have been in education for 30 years. I don't know if you saw my face as Emma was telling a story. It was like almost shock, because I had exactly the same scenario. As I qualified from my primary education degree, and I started to work in a school, and they had a maternity cover in nursery, and I ended up doing that job for my first year, and I am so pleased that I had the opportunity to do it, because all my experience really had been sort of key stage 2. So actually it gave me that first-hand experience of what it was like to be an early years practitioner. Um, Sort of fast forward 15 years later or so, maybe 12, I became a head teacher of a school in the northeast of England, in a very challenging and deprived area where early years was the absolute key to supporting these children on their lifelong journey. And we actually went through the process of setting up a 2-year-old setting as well, because we realised the value of getting the children into that education system as early as possible. So with that fantastic team around me, they taught me so much, my practitioners within that school. I was then able to take that forward to my next venture, which was the British School of Barcelona, international school here in Barcelona, which is where I happened to be spending my summer this year. And I became the head teacher of early years and primary. And again, fantastic opportunity to really grow and nurture this fantastic nursery and reception setting, and to see how that fed into the main school, because it kind of worked a little bit separately. So that was a great journey. So 8 years in North Tyneside, 6 years as a head teacher in Barcelona, and then the last 2 years I've been in the UAE as the principal of a large primary school with a nursery and FS1, FS2, so a separate nursery where the children come in from 18 months to 2 years. So really helped me to focus and have an understanding on how that journey begins and goes all the way through into the primary, and then obviously supporting colleagues as to how that transition works into secondary. So yeah, very blessed for my journey.
Yeah. I hear that in both, and again, it's happenstance that you step into something and it just changes your perspective, and how important that is. Just like for both of you, this. I work as a director of a primary trust. So we've got 5 primary schools, all of them with nurseries. One of them is a nursery, an infant school. So kind of involved in that. I was working with sort of strategy day yesterday and talking exactly, Emma, as you were saying, about vision and values. But very much how, the question that we were asking, and my section was that so how do we turn vision and values into reality? What will we be doing that will make those a reality in our organisation? So that and curiosity was one of those, in there. But I guess there's a lot of people that, and even in some of the government dialogue at the moment, it's get school ready, using this time to get school ready. And there are people that we've come across that say, you can do the play and then we get into serious school. But that's bad thinking about schools, and that's certainly not what you have just shown with some passion. So let's start with, what is it about the early years foundation stage that is so important? What is it? I mean, we know 7 criteria that they've got to do. 5 of them are being measured, that they need to get to a particular standard in the English system. What is it that's important, Emma? Just as you pick up a glass, what Emma Tibbitts, sorry, tell us a bit about what you would expect to see, and what is it that's important there within the foundation stage.
Well, there is so much that I could say. There's much.
Yes, I know.
Just to sum it up, I think there's a number of key things. And I always talk about effective early years practice, and where we can learn the most from it is actually looking at pedagogy slowed down. So I do think that education as a whole, we're unfortunately still being very driven by systems. But in early years, where there is, it is less formal, it's less formalized, where it's done effectively, things are slowed down, and children have the opportunities to truly showcase who they are, their characters, and have the opportunity to explore and learn in a way that is child centered. And I think, the contrast to that in our system is that when they leave the early years, their independence, which we so want, we want them to be school ready, which essentially means we want them to have some independence. Yet what we unintentionally do beyond the early years is just strip that away. So it's almost like we give them the start to start learning, and then suddenly it's like, no, you will sit here. All the choices that, we want you to make in early years to direct your learning in effective practice, when you get to year 1 or beyond, actually the teacher's going to direct those things for you or make those decisions. So I think it's about that openness. I think it's about having the child at the center, and that collaboration between the practitioners and the children, and the practitioners, children and families, that is done under a spotlight that isn't done in a way beyond the early years. So, building those professional relationships with the children where they are truly known. And so you can really effectively help and guide them, not direct them, but guide them to, making those steps in their development. So yeah, the open ended, let them be curious, let them be imaginative, let them go and explore. We have the messy play, we have, the access to outdoors, that, all of those opportunities are really open to nurture that individual child at their pace. And yeah, a bit more time to focus on the pedagogy around that and not the system.
And I guess that's so. The implication there is, I mean, certainly when people are looking at it, it's that siloed idea. So we'll go from this to this to this, rather than what I would recognise in early years education is that free flow. What you said, that messy play, and I know of schools that are doing the kind of a bent towards outside first rather than inside first, and then those. But then obviously in England, particularly, and in sort of northeast Europe, that's weather dependent. But and how that operates. Emma L.
Just quickly, there's a very famous saying that all early years practitioners will relate to, which is there's no such thing as bad weather, it's just bad clothing. So get them outside in all weathers. And I often ask practitioners, and I ask them in the autumn term, right? Because it's easier in the summer term to answer this. But if I ask practitioners, if I asked your children whether they think you like being outdoors, what would they say?
That's an interesting
so
question.
No one wants to go out and do that outdoor shift when it's cold and it's wet. And, I get that. But wrap up warm and get outside.
Yeah. I know. An ex-colleague of mine that runs a nursery that's based in the outdoors. It's called the Wild Things, and a fantastic shout out to Kelly Guthrie. You've done a brilliant job, outstanding facility, now growing massively. But the children are outside. That's it, and they come in when they need to, and it's a brilliant. A kind of ethic, and we know, Uda School and all of it, it's moving away from the kind of Victorian box idea, and it's brilliant to step into that, where there's that no barrier to inside outside. It's just it's superb. Emma Ledger, step in. You were nodding your way through what Emma was saying there. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's super important that we consider that transitional stage. So if I'm quite a systematic thinker, so thinking about this whole concept of getting it right in the early years, I see two fundamental areas that need to be looked at with a really close lens. And one of them is the provision of the early years education, what that looks like for our nursery and reception children, or FS1, FS2, whatever we're going to call it, whichever setting we're in. And then the second part is the transition. So all of the curiosity, all of the independence, all of the messy play, all of those routines, how are we ensuring that there isn't a hard stop when the national curriculum begins at year one? And I think they're two really key important parts of your whole focus for school improvement planning, for driving the curriculum, for your staff development and training. And they're things that you don't let go of at any point in the year. I see so often that schools will have in their strategic plan, their school improvement plan, transition is an action. We need to lead on a great transition. It goes in the plan at the beginning of the year, and then maybe it gets sorted out in that final term. And I think really it's key that plan is revisited and is active and is live throughout the year, because transition doesn't just happen in the summer term as we're preparing children to move into year one. So I think if I come at it from a leadership perspective, there's some key messages for leaders there in order to focus very much on those key areas throughout the year, regularly reviewing, regularly addressing, regularly evaluating to ensure that that transition into key stage one maintains that momentum throughout the year. And even when they're ending year one, are we ready to be sitting down at a desk in year two? Or do we still need some continuous provision type activities as we move into year two to address some of the areas of learning that some children still may need support with?
And isn't that, there's the sense in which, we've got to this systematized education system where it is the same for every child. And I mean, MRL, what you've just described in the sense is that we know it at the early years stage because it is evident that there are some learners that are kind of engaging in a different way earlier on. But then we have this expectation when they move into key stage one or key stage two or whatever, elementary school or however you describe that again, that they've got to conform, and it is one size for all of them. With that transition, sorry, go.
No, I was just going to jump in there, and I think there's a bit of a myth that needs busting on that front, because especially if, like Emma and I, have not had that experience in the early years, and you've finished your teacher training, you've only had experience in key stage one or two. If you go delve into the national curriculum and you see what's expected to be delivered, there's this myth that, well, we've got to reach these end of year expectations. So they have to sit at a desk to do it. But there's nowhere in the national curriculum or in any scheme of work, which whatever schools are using, that says how to do that. And I think It is something, again, that needs to be vision driven. It needs to come from the leaders of the school.
Yes.
The best transition I've ever seen is where there has been a leader that oversees transition. They're not the early years leader, they're not the key stage one leader. It's somebody who's got that oversight for transition, who will work with the year one and the key stage leaders, but making sure that staff feel enabled. They have a little bit of an artistic license when it comes to delivering, but again, that does need to come from a leadership supportive perspective of taking those risks. Let's be experimental, and let's make sure that we don't just then go to sit at a desk, because you can see how much progress a child makes in reception, learning about number, through exploratory play, through curiosity, all of those wonderful, passionate things that Emma was talking about before. The progress they make is phenomenal. So why do we then sit and start some abstract work in year one?
Yeah. Emma, go on. You're agreeing. Just
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, there's so many things I want to say, but I think just touching on that, lessons for leaders as well. I think a lot of my experience, and I say this in a supportive capacity, a lot of leaders actually feel quite anxious about sort of what's going on in early years, because they themselves have not had any experience in there, a bit like we did when we came out of university without that experience. But now, find yourself in the shoes of a head teacher who's been in post for 6-7 years or more, and actually still hasn't had that reality of experience in the early years. It can be quite daunting. And there is a real lack of sort of support, I think, for leaders with an early years lens. And one of the things I try and do is to promote that for leaders. Say, look, hey, it's okay if you feel a bit afraid about it. Let's talk it through. And, you have, a professional responsibility to understand the pedagogy and, the best practice for early years, the transitions into year one, and to kind of, shake up those expectations. I think, to your point, the national curriculum, that, everyone thinks I've got to do it to the T. One classic example I talk to all the time is the brilliant learning objective. Says what, teaching children what do plants need to grow. I think it's a year 1 and 2 science objective. Now, I don't know about you, you've been in early years a long time, but pretty much most nursery children can tell me what plants need to grow. The national curriculum says we need to cover it in year 1 and 2, great. But, I've seen schools have that as their overarching thing for 6 weeks. Okay, first of all, our children already know it, most of them. And second of all, what else can we teach them about plants, right? That doesn't encroach into the other learning objectives of the curriculum, but we can be creative with the things we are exposing our children to, going along their curiosity beyond the national curriculum. And I think the other thing that you both spoke about here is you use the word expectation. And one of the things, again, that I find is generally, especially in the early years, our expectation of these brilliant children, where neuroscience tells us their brains are at their most malleable, we dumb things down unintentionally. We do not have high enough expectations. And according to NASA, and a project I talk about a lot that was conducted in the 1960s, 98% of our 4-year-old children are creative geniuses. And when they leave school, only 2% of them are. So to me, that says it all. And it raises the question, what is school for? Which we won't go into now. But having those high expectations, and I think the early years environment enables us to explore and push those expectations more, and we get onto the national curriculum, and that's where the kind of lack of confidence we go into coverage, don't we? And it just limits. So I think early years, there's life without limits, really, and then the limits start coming in, and so I could say lots on transition as well, but they were the two things that really stuck out when you were just talking.
It's really important. I guess that's because I know, secondary colleagues and upper primary colleagues that have that kind of view that, well, let that happen in early years and then we'll start the proper schooling. And I know may not be a comfortable thing to admit to, but that is how we see it at every stage. Maths in key stage 3. Well, don't worry about what went on in key stage 2. We'll start again at key stage 3. I mean, the number of times in the last 40 years I've heard people say that. It is, maybe 38 years when the national curriculum started. But the reality, both of you have said, the national curriculum is a broad description. It was only ever intended to be 60% of the curriculum. I just think, an illustration. A friend of mine teaches outdoor ed, he's been a national mountain leader and does all sorts of outdoor ed. He trains regularly, teaches in Scotland, in the lowlands of Scotland, and actually goes to Kelso and trains in a lovely building that looks out over the lowlands of Scotland. And one day he asked them, so 50, 60 teachers in the room, how many of you have taken children out? So you're in this environment, you work here. How many of you have taken children out there? And look at it, because it's behind me, great glass screen. Not a single hand went up. Not a single person had actually thought about taking the children out of the classroom into that environment, even though they live in the middle of it. And I guess that's part of what we're saying about that. Use your creativity, take the opportunities, which is why some of these things, learning outside the classroom, outside first, breaking the boundaries. And it's the same, Emma L, as you just said about this, this myth around proper education is at a desk. It's not, doesn't have to be. You can do all sorts of other things. So, really the challenge. Go on, I can see you.
I was just going to say, I'm wondering as you're talking, hearing about, sometimes we sit there and think, why don't we collaborate? Why don't we join up our thinking more? Why don't our secondary, all these questions that we talk about a lot, but we're still not doing it. And I do wonder whether, and I would argue that maybe our practitioners, our leaders are not instinctively collaborative or creative because they weren't taught to be at school themselves. And if we continue in the system as it is, we're always going to get what we've always got, right? That famous, I think it was Henry Ford that said that, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always got. And what we need to start doing is deliberately, intentionally teaching. Some people call them skills. I think there's a difference between skills and characteristics. We won't have that debate today. But, nurturing and growing and explicitly modeling and teaching things like collaboration. How do I become collaborative? And why is that important? And how is this going to help me and each other, as I grow through life? How can I be creative? What does creativity mean to me? Is that valued? Schools unintentionally kill creativity, right? So Ken Robinson's most watched talk, do schools kill creativity? Yes, we do. We're going to draw a picture. It's going to be a red bus. Here's a piece of paper. Here's the template. And then we have 30 of them stuck up on the wall. I do think effective early years practice mostly has moved away from that now, which I'm delighted to see. But, unfortunately, that still sometimes is the model. So it's hard for us to drive that change when we ourselves were not part of a system where we have been explicitly modelled and taught to do those things. But I want that for our children of today, right? So yeah.
Emma, you speak to Emma L. I wanted to ask you about your experience recently in Dubai and the UAE. Because we're talking about inbuilt expectations, inbuilt silos of understanding, and so much of what we do is based on our own experiential past. What's going on? I guess the other characteristic is that parents have an expectation, and particularly when you're in the environment where they're paying for an education system, there's a driver, the market driver, that they get what they want. And I guess there's that balance of, do we give what they want, or do we do something that's going to be really effective? And how's that affecting education in the Middle East? What's going on? Emma L, please pick up.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. The private, just dropped a little headphone. Hopefully you can still hear me. The private education sector in Dubai obviously is predominantly private there and independent. So parents will choose a British school because they understand the fundamentals of the British curriculum. So therefore, the expectations aren't too dissimilar. Obviously, there are other expectations that come with paying for things in terms of your feedback from teachers and how you are involved or not involved in your child's education. But there's a couple of things going on. So the KHDA, who are the education authority there in Dubai, they have paused inspections at the moment and did last year. They are relooking at their inspection system, which I think is really refreshing. They have the Dubai 33 strategy, I believe it's called. I was really fortunate to attend one of their futures conferences recently, and it was very much about learning skills for the future, or skills for tomorrow, really. So it goes back to what Emma was talking about there before, about these life skills that we need to teach our children. So it is really encouraging to see that the Middle East are thinking really openly. They're already looking at what the jobs and skills are going to look like for the students of the future. And as a result of that, are rewriting their inspection system. Now, on another side of that, when I first went to Dubai, we were inspected quite quickly, and it was fantastic to see that one of our outcomes was to focus more on transition from early years to year one. And it was great, it was accurate, it was right. We were kind of probably not as focused on that as we needed to be. And it really gave the school a drive with a license, because that's what the KHDA were also supporting in their inspection report. So really great, really refreshing. And for us, the schools out there are large, right? Really large, so 6, 7, 8 form entry. So we really, and other schools were looking at it this way as well. How many of your practitioners are in year one who were in a past life an early years practitioner? How many of your practitioners in early years were previously a year one practitioner? So it's just about building your team so that, yes, you need the training, yes, you need the development, but you also need some core understanding from practitioners from whom others can learn from. And it is great to see that really is being prioritised in the Middle East. But just going back to a really earlier point that you made right at the beginning about school preparation and preparing children for school, I do think we need to move away from that terminology and talk about it's preparing students for life, preparing children for life. So these life skills that begin at this age then need to be continued to be built upon. And if I just may add in here, I was really, really blessed when I was in Barcelona to be able to work with Professor Guy Claxton, who has his 7 habits of learning. I always get that one. And he was it's not just putting a label on it. It's what does that learning habit look like when they're 3? How do they know to get better at that learning habit? Because he really challenged us on that as well. Yeah, okay, we're putting the label on it. We're doing it really well at 4-year-old. But does the child know what they need to do to improve, to become a better collaborator when they're 5 and then when they're 6? So it is about those learning habits and that focus on learning behaviours throughout their primary school. So those key skills and core skills are definitely at the forefront of this curriculum drive that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and I couldn't emphasise that enough. That's so important. I mean, the stuff Guy Claxton's done, even so Professor Guy Claxton, those learning habits are just how we've lost that sense in a lot of education. And I think from your point, Emma, about the inspection frameworks, whether that's Ofsted or ASI or the regional Ofsted, people will be talking about accountability. Accountability has some kind of level of measurement, and Emma Tibbitts and I and Mark have talked about that thing about measurement, things being driven by measurement leads us to this place where if it's easy to measure, it's easy to track. That doesn't mean it's necessarily important or purposeful. And I guess that, so what you're saying is focusing on that, that idea of transition's important. What do you need to do to make that a purposeful activity? And it's not just about being, I think Emma Tibbitts, you and I said, as we were talking previously, a lot of the understanding about school ready is not in nappies. And that's, I just want to draw in, we've talked a lot about the profession and the professionalism of it. Where do the parents come into this? Where do family come into this journey? And your experience of that, Emma? Emma Tibbitts, sorry.
Just waiting for the nod. Well, parents are absolutely essential right from the start. They are the people who know their children better than anyone and are entrusting essentially them over to your care. So it doesn't just you hand them over and we'll take it from here, and that disconnect between, well, we'll do the teaching stuff and you just do the parent stuff. Actually, it is around that collaboration, isn't it? Because I hear so often people say things like, oh, but teachers these days are so much more than teachers. They're social workers and they're family liaisons. And I sit there and I think actually an effective teacher has always done all of those things to an extent. I'm not talking about the logistics or the qualification, but we are there to nurture these children and to build those relationships. And that doesn't happen by just telling them, how to pronounce all of the different sounds in all of the different phonemes to help them to read. So parents have to be involved absolutely from the start. And I think there's so many ways that I've seen early years do that. Sometimes it's quite formal, like come in for a curriculum meeting or come in for a settle meeting. And I think it can be a lot more informal than that to an extent, especially in those very early days. Because again, otherwise we're just getting them into a system where parents sit and we talk and you listen. And it's not that developing of those professional relationships at a deeper level. So I think, there's lots of challenges there as well. But parents have got to be involved, and also it shouldn't just stop then as well at the end of early years. Again, they're going to year one now, right? They've graduated early years, brilliant. That's it. They've flown the nest and they're in year one. They've graduated. I know there's lots of early years like reception graduation ceremonies happening this week in schools I'm working in to celebrate they finished reception. And part of me thinks, no, don't ever leave. But yeah, so.
That's a tradition. I mean, that's an interesting comment, Emma. These graduation ceremonies seem to have, it's a very American thing that's come to the UK. Started at year 13, but it's kind of gradually worked its way through the school. Actually, I did see at a reception school the other day that had limousines out for their. I'm not sure that that's necessarily.
And I guess the intention there is to celebrate, right? And there's nothing wrong with
of course.
the question is, what are we celebrating? Because I often show a slide in some of my PowerPoints and presentations that I give, and it's just a picture of, if you Googled success, out of the first sort of the first 12 images that come up are pictures of 18-year-olds or 21-year-olds who have graduated, and they've got their hats and they've got their scroll, and that is what success looks like. But I think and you touched on this earlier around the parental expectations. Some people, because of their own journey, will define success as going on to go and get that, become the lawyer or the doctor or whatever it may be. But actually, I'm a mummy to two. And success for my children will be, emotional well-being and just happiness, really, contentment and being kind. And so I think it's, how do we juggle those? What does success mean? And I think schools need to ask themselves that question. What is it? How will we know that we have done a good job, or our children are successful when they leave us? What is it that we're looking for there to celebrate, not necessarily to measure? Because we talked about the skills, and I think it's great having these frameworks and looking at the things that we can look fors that we would expect for a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, etc. But our system is obsessed with measurement, and we value what we measure and we measure what we value. And I think it's great, some of these things like collaboration are coming into the spotlight, but we must be, I think there is a warning there that we don't get obsessed with trying to check how we have got better at it. And that's where I bring in that differentiation between a skill and a characteristic, because a skill, let's take the skill of reading. So those initial, talking of early years, identifying those graphemes, being able to recognize their phonemes and put those sounds together, blend to read. That is a skill that you learn, okay? And you can measure very easily whether you have got better at that, because you will go from not recognizing anything to reading fluently. Quite a clear progression. However, when you bring in something like creativity or curiosity, how do we define and measure how curious you are? I couldn't argue, Chris, I know you're very curious, but so is an 18-month-old baby. There's a 6-month-old baby. They're exploring by putting things in their mouth. They're showing a curiosity about the world around them. So have you got more curious? Or I think we open up a can of worms when we try and measure those things. So
that isn't that
and celebrate the character.
Sorry, that's the absolutely, and isn't that the Ken Robinson idea? We've dampened all of that by moving to systematized measurement, and I guess there's that kind of concern I have that we mark these things that we're going to measure because they're measurable, and they become, as you just said, we measure because it's important, and we think that it's important, and it becomes the driver. And that's where um, Guy Claxton, Bill Lucas, the creativity in education, so professors in universities that are focusing on what learning could be. I love the mastery stuff. So we're not talking about, your grade 6, your grade 7, I perceive myself as being a novice in something and I want to be better. That curiosity will take me further. That's a different way of achieving it than I'm a 5, I'm no good, I'm never going to do that again, which is reductive and not useful in life. But we're not like that as adults, but we expect that. Sorry, go on, Emma, please.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's how we run early years, isn't it? Right. So children learn through the little projects that they delve into. The teachers foster that imagination. They might enable it a little bit further by bringing in certain resources because they can see where the interests of the children are. And then we move into year 1 and we start with a topic web or a project, well, not even projects necessarily, but on how do plants grow? What do plants need to grow? So if we are really getting it right in the early years, then we need to be learning from that. And I am going to go back to my time in North Tyneside when I think I have never experienced such an exciting time for learners. And bearing in mind, I think we had like 58, 60% children receiving pupil premium, so free school meals or the disadvantaged group. And some of these children just weren't engaged. It's a societal issue, especially as the older they got. So we looked at what they were doing really well in early years. Then we started to do some research around it. We looked at Ron Berger, we looked at PBL, that ethic of excellence, the peer critique and feedback, and making sure that children were given a hook into their learning and asking the children where their passions were. And we achieved the whole school. We did it. We did a creative curriculum. It was phenomenal, and I had some champions driving that. Some real on the ground teachers driving it. They had my support. My vision was there, but they were the ones who brought it to life. And then we also introduced technology at the same time. This is like 2012 or something. We brought in iPads as well, and we did some case studies on that. And the results were that our children we were in the top 10% of progress in the country on Raise Online. We were up there in the green because the children had very, very low starting points and achieved exceptionally well. Now, I don't know it couldn't be attributed to one thing. It definitely couldn't. It wasn't the technology. I really truly believe it was because we were extremely creative in our approach to the curriculum from the 2-year-olds all the way to the 11-year-olds. The classrooms were thrown upside down, immersive classroom environments, hooks, term-long projects where the children were mastering, but they were leading that learning. Just mirrored exactly what was happening in the early years. And yeah, amazing success as a result. So it is about how creative we are with the curriculum, but also going back to what Emma was saying before about are those characters embedded throughout the school years, not just when you leave early years and start year 1, like you kind of, they become an add-on. Where do they feature in the planning? Where are the teachers talking about that in the learning process? Are we saying great job to children because they've achieved something, or are we explaining to them, wow, you really kept trying, look what you achieved there? So those dispositions, are they being enabled because of the language that we're using, or do we just do that in the early years? So yeah, creative curriculum.
It's so important, and again, it doesn't just stop at year 1. It's got, as you just said, it's got to go right the way through. And I would argue that there's actually a journey that needs to go through to year 11 and year 13, and we kind of lose those elements later in the year. And you think these are young people when they get to 16, 18 that are then going to engage in interview conversations and engagement conversations with employers and other adults. And if they've lost that sense of those things, the curiosity, the empowerment, the things that matter at that point, how do they? And that's why employers are coming back saying, well, these children are not work ready, so they're not, in terms of life and all of it. We need to be building that all the way through, and that's a kind of a tenor of all that we've been talking about. Smart curriculum. I know Emma Tibbitts and Mark do within Foundations First, although the concentration is on laying that foundation. It's got to flow the way through. I'm just going to pause a second and say, look, if you're listening to this, please stay with us. I know this is a recorded version, so we've not been bringing people into the conversation as we do normally, but please do like, share, and comment if you can. Now, we're on the various different platforms, so if you're here on LinkedIn or if you're on YouTube, please do get involved. It will also be on Spotify and Substack. So there are communities that are growing in those both of those areas. We're looking to expand the sort of engagement with this. But please, if you're there, because this is a recorded version, leave your comment on the post, and then one of us will get back to you and grow a conversation. And as ever, we've said, please do get involved in the conversation. So please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for being here. Now, look, we've gone through kind of the big issues. I'd like to just ask, if you both are very experienced in the area. If you look back on it and you think about your experiences, what either as a kind of I would do this differently or I would change that. Give us an example of something that's been exceptional in your view. So something that's gone on in a school. Emma Ledger, you just talked about what was going on in sort of north of England in your school. Give us so that people that are listening can get a view. So what would it look like in the classroom? What would something exceptional look like? And give us an example of a kind of activity. Emma Tibbitts, you go for you. I can see you've got something in your head that you're thinking of.
You can read my mind, Chris. We know each other too well. So lots of exceptional practice that I could talk to. There's lots of not so much exceptional practice too, but we'll go with the exceptional. There's one particular nursery that's always stood out in my mind. I went to visit about 10 years ago now, and they're still absolutely thriving. It's called Alfreton Nursery School, and it's led by an amazing, forward-thinking and research-driven practitioner called Amanda Hubble, and she is such an inspiration because the whole ethos there is learning without limits. So the children at Alfreton come in a bit like you were saying, Emma. It's significantly low starting points, and the progress that they make is off the charts. And the reason is this, and I've seen it firsthand, is from the moment those children walk in that door. The expectation of them, there is no limits of what they can do. There's no, I'm going to set the bar and they're just going to jump through the hoops and get to this point. And at the centre of their practice, there's lots of pedagogy that informs what they do, but they really drive the philosophy for children approach. So I think it's been around for 60 odd years now. Dr. Philip Lippmann, I believe, was the sort of author, and he basically looked at how we do things differently in the classroom so that we don't just churn out students who can regurgitate into a test. And it became this approach, and lots of schools adopt it. But again, it was like, it's only for like year 2 up, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, it's a philosophical approach. Of course, it can be done at any point. And Alfreton have adopted this, and I have seen them run sessions with children where we talk about topics and themes. I have an activity that I often do in some of my training. It says, can you match these themes to the key stage? And I put things up like neuroscience, fetal development, under the sea, traditional tales, dinosaurs. So I mix up with those typical early years topics that people have run with for years. But and everyone sits there and, that's definitely key stage 4, and that's computational thinking. That's definitely from key stage 3. And then I revealed to them that actually these are all topics that Alfreton Nursery have for their children, or themes. I wouldn't call them topics. They're themes to explore. And they put these concepts age appropriately, I will stress, fetal development is done age appropriately for the children to explore. The language that they have, we talk about the development of that oracy. I've never met a bunch of 3-year-olds who can articulate with, and it's not just words they can churn out, with such a deep understanding of what they're talking about. One child said to me, I said, well, tell me a bit about your day. Like, what do you do? They said, well, we don't have a timetable here. And I said, what do you mean? Said, well, we don't use the word time. We talk in algorithms. And I was like, sorry, what? And just because they've been exposed and allowed to explore and allowed to ask those big questions, and they are happy, thriving children who have brilliant outcomes. So, learning without limits, don't choose where the bar is, open it up. And philosophy for children as an approach is brilliant.
I think Ken Robinson would be proud of that in that sense of Emma Ledger, an example.
An example of really great transition, I think, is just remembering some really key points. So, first of all, understanding that transition is a process, not an event. And so schools that do it really well, they start early, they build familiarity, it's really gradual, it helps children to build the confidence. They bring in the social stories, they bring in the visuals, and they even have their role play corners of a different part of the school so they can imagine themselves in different environments. So seeing transition as a process and not an event. And then I guess it's bridging that gap between FS and year one, which is the key area that we were talking about today. So avoiding the whole cliff edge, making sure that we're using the same language. And that's, again, that's a leadership thing. The leadership of the school, are we consistent in the language, in the behaviour structures and strategies, in our expectations, in the no ceiling for all learners? And that full approach needs to be aligned across the school. And making sure there's opportunities for co-planning, for teachers to be observant of one another, open door scenarios, just an openness of sharing of great practice between the two phases, if you like. And just so that understanding of developmental stages, just hear one teacher know that actually the children do know what a plant needs to grow by the end of reception, because often there's a real separation there in many schools, isn't there? And then one thing we haven't talked a lot about is kind of the child and the child's voice. We talk about is the child ready for transition, but we need to think, is the school ready for the child? And have we got that transition right there? So are we listening to the child? What is it they're excited about? What is it they're worried about? And then we can respond and shape how we're going to manage that according to whatever responses they give. So really listening to the child. And then the last thing was what we were talking about there as parents. Parents are our transition partners. If they are worried and fearful and scared at home, that is going to be propelled onto their child. And we were talking about the graduation. How many parents cry at graduation? My baby's grown up. They're not going to be in aliens anymore. And it's how do we support them? And this is an area of growth, giving them the language that we're using at school. So it's a real partnership. And that's where I've seen the best practice, really kind of hand-holding for many of those parents. Because actually what most parents want, in my experience, is to have a really happy, kind, caring child, not a one whose success is off the chart because they can read earlier than everybody else. So it is just talk to parents along the way, make sure that they're part of all of have a real open door policy, and it just gives that opportunity for growth as a family.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask the kind of penultimate question to you, Emma. So if there was, in your experience of all that you've just described and what you've just articulated is so powerful, those things, if they were in place, there's opportunities for leaders and teachers to get involved in that and have that conversation. But what would you see within the system that we have, into your experience across the world? You're currently in back in Spain, but you've been in the Middle East. What if we looked at the whole area of early years education? If there's one thing that you could change about the whole process, what would it be? I mean, I know there are many things, and in our conversations there could be lots. But if you were going to drill down to one thing, what would it be that you would want to see changed most in? Emma L.
Emma L. Me.
Yes.
It's really slowing down really slowing down the transition process. Like, we don't need to be jumping to learning at desks and tables so quickly, and making sure that so many schools are doing the curiosity approach. Like, if I had a magic wand, it would be like, it's part of the curriculum. Like, we have to all be delivering through a curious approach to learning and making sure that children are able to access a variety of different learning areas, learning environments, learning tools that are not structured. And I think it's so hard, as Emma was saying there, when you don't learn enough at university to become a skillful early years practitioner. And you only learn when you're on the job. So if your school environment hasn't got that expectations, how can you, sorry, my AirPod's just fallen out again. How can we teach these practitioners to teach with openness and allow the children to lead on their learning? So it's just really slow down the process and allow practitioners to follow their own, what they know is right, and I think in with that comes assessment. So I've been very, very lucky that in the UAE and in Barcelona there wasn't so much expectation around the tick sheets and the assessments. Obviously you need your evidence for development, and it's really important to have that AFL, but I'm not sure what it's like currently in the UK for that. And I think when you've got that assessment, the shackles are on, and it really does prevent you from being creative in your approach. Emma, you could probably add to that and say more about that. I'm not sure where we're at with it at the moment.
Emma, go on. So just so
yeah,
the change.
We've got a lot of time left, and I think again, so much we could say, isn't there? But I think, just touching what you just said there, Emma, in terms of that kind of, for me, what I would like to see is that a greater shared understanding across the whole education sector of the importance of early years, and a knowledge of effective practice in early years and the impacts of that, and how we can learn from it across the whole learning journey all the way through to 18. So, I think it's that we've done full circle here. But we do have that. We still have too much of that. Don't they just play all day? And, that disconnect to the valuable, high quality work that is done. And so often almost jested about, like, well, you just turn up and they just play, don't they? I couldn't do early years because, they've got bogeys. That's the kind of, and it's like, hang on, we are highly qualified, skilled practitioners who know a lot about effective teaching and learning, and I would love to see more collaboration across the whole education sector, which does really appreciate and value that. Otherwise, someone said this recently, it's my final comment, and I thought it was brilliant. It says, otherwise we might hit the target, but we're going to completely miss the point. And I think that's really important, because they can churn out their grades and we can get them to be successful academics, but we're completely missing those individuals and their characters. And I think that would not be a picture of success for me.
And I think that's a brilliant position to kind of conclude. It just feels like there's so much that we could talk about early years, and it's not something that's been concentrated on enough in the system. But I'm just so grateful to the two of you for the conversation that we've just had. It's really important. I think we'll come back to more. I think there's much more to talk about. So if you just stay online for a second as I just conclude the show, thank you to both of you. It's been really a real privilege to have the conversation. Now, this we're concluding now. So if you've got comments and questions, please do put them onto the various platforms that we're out on, please, and we'll get back to you and talk. If you want further conversations with either Emma Tibbitts or Emma Ledger about what they're doing, please just drop us a line and we'll put you in touch. Next show in 2 weeks' time will also be pre-recorded. But thank you for being here. Such a conversation on early years education, so important. Things that we come away, we need to change our thinking. We need to think about what we're getting out at the end, and is it what we want it to be? And maybe we should start training our leaders more in early years education. I think that's why I walk away from this. It's really an interesting perspective that although we've got teachers that are training for primary education, very little concentration on early years, and there's been that conversation for years. So thank you for joining us this morning. Get involved in the conversation, like, share and subscribe. If you've got something to say, come and join us, and maybe you'll be part of a future podcast. But thank you for being here. We'll see you again very shortly.